this is the first of many steps. Here we are on September 25th. There's a redevelopment plan presentation. You have an ordinance in front of you, a redevelopment plan in front of you. Again, that would sort of kick off, so all these TBDs, we can start to fill in some dates, but I didn't want to be presumptuous, so they're not there. And so that is, in many places they call it first reading. In some cities, like in Hudson County, they would just read it by ordinance and then tell the public to come back in 10 days. We do things differently in Morristown. We do our work up front. But that is just a first, this is like a first moment to let people know that something's happening. And the first part really envisioned in the statute. Then we would go to the planning board to do, as we've done in the past, master plan consistency review. We would ask the planning board to go through a similar type of traffic presentation, a similar in-depth where they could ask their questions. This is 9 additional people that spend several hours each month listening to development hearings in this town and have for many, many, many years, many of them, to hear that presentation and talk about how this works with the town's master plan or doesn't. Then we would go to a second reading, a public hearing, and potentially adoption of the ordinance after the planning board kind of gives their input back to you. Then at that point, the governing body, the administration is sort of empowered to go back to the redeveloper and come up with the finer points of the deal. To take all those things that we've now listed as this has to happen with the redeveloper agreement, that has to happen with the redeveloper agreement, this has to be refined in there, and all those T's need to be crossed, I's need to be dotted, financial agreements, schedules, completion dates, all that kind of stuff happens in that redeveloper agreement. And then only after that's done would a developer be permitted, under the language of this plan, to proceed to the planning board for a typical site plan application. So I just wanted,
just one extra step here is that before they go to the planning board, they have to come back before the governing body. It basically give a more detailed presentation so that the governing body can then say it can go to the planning board. So they've got to come back to the governing body first, which is something we require in the redevelopment plan. There's like a consistency review by the governing body in the administration with the redevelopment plan before they go to the planning board for their site plan. So we go through that extra step and extra safeguard so that the governing body gets another look at it.
So I just want to make it clear to everybody that everything we've gone through to date is pre-statute, pre-statutory. This is not part of the statutory process. This has been a very, very methodical review. I appreciate all the public participation. I understand why people have paid such close attention to this and why the concerns that have been voiced. I think that we've addressed them. I hope that we have. Again, I appreciate all the participation that you all have given in terms of making this better. And again, this would be the first of many steps to kind of bring this into the formal statutory process. So I think that that's it. I'll make myself available and the engineers available for any questions you have.
All right, thank you, Phil. This time, questions from the council, please, during the presentation.
Let me start off, if it's helpful, to just explain to the public the sort of process that the council went through from the first draft of this redevelopment plan that was given to us on September 9th through where we are today. Essentially, we received the first draft on September 9th. There was an anticipated next redevelopment meeting scheduled for September 12th. Once we got an opportunity to read it that night, and the comments were significant, we encouraged the administration to postpone that meeting to today's meeting so that we could incorporate all of our concerns and comments and questions into the revised plan. Some of the more significant changes that have been made through 4 o'clock this afternoon include the following, and if, bear with me, we require that the plan, in the plan that the town provide the results of its traffic study at the detailed level that it's getting to now, and again, in a public information center prior to the council's adoption of the redevelopment agreement. So at that time we'll know more than what we know now. It includes clarification on the traffic impacts in the corridor and the intersections, which you've seen has been done. It defines the developer's responsibility to identify mitigation measures, costs and impacts, and specifically says that the town or the developer will implement those mitigation measures, and that's subject to the redevelopment agreement. It includes minimum pedestrian circulation and safety requirements, the traffic beacons or what have you, and the other measures, minimum bicycle improvement safety standards, and the secondary standards that could be implemented at the discretion of the planning board. It includes minimum safety standards for ADA compliance and people with visually impaired persons. It specified the specific setback, arcade, and public space dimensions. It clarified the maximum height and footprint of the parking structure, which was not previously included. It included the requirement for free short-term parking into the garage for patrons of the retail establishments. To a lesser extent, the plan also includes provisions for, basically recommendations for provisions for reduced heat island effect in the public spaces, basically, hardscape. It includes recommendations to reduce bird strikes, basically deaths caused by windows through window treatments. It encourages the use of solar-powered compaction trash receptacles in the public spaces and compaction facilities for the commercial garbage areas. It encourages the use of biking to work through various facilities, indoor parking, changing areas, lockers, etc. And another other items. I think the one that changed today at 4 o'clock was there was concerns by a number of council members about the retail space and what would we be getting in retail, and the interest in preserving the mom and pop stores. Unfortunately, in this sort of development, these stores are not going to be able to be saved, preserved as they are, in the construction. But language has been added to the plan that basically commits the developer and the town through the redevelopment agreement to establish sort of physical and potentially financial incentives to create smaller spaces for smaller businesses or business incubation areas or markets. And again, all of these elements are conceptual, but commitments in the plan so that when we get to the redevelopment agreement or when we get to the planning board review, everyone can go back and say it's in the plan. So basically, you guys got to address it. So I think we've done an outstanding job of working with the planners and the traffic engineers and the administration, and it's been a really great iterative process. So I defer to my council colleagues.
Just to build on what Stefan was talking about, I think when we publish this report, I think it's important that we actually show you the red line version. there's more red line in the document than there is text. A lot of that was, and I hope people heard it during Phil's presentation, a lot of the concerns are being addressed. Okay, what we heard was the architecture. You know, people are concerned that you have 350 of building here. Is there going to be architectural differentiation? Again, when you read the plan, you'll see a lot in the plan in terms of design standards and architectural guidance. But the other reality is the planning board does have a lot to say at that level. So the process doesn't stop here, and it's right, because with every level of the process, it's getting better, and the plan is getting better. And I think the process itself is actually proving very valuable to what we're going to be doing on this site. Just to, before we get started, should we ask questions? Okay, if we could, let's start, if we could start with traffic. And again, some of the questions I'm asking is just really to reinsert the fact that they looked at it, okay? And my first question on traffic is Brian, you are retained by the town.
So, I'm gonna move to that.
That's a good idea. Okay, Brian, you are retained by the town, correct?
I am.
Correct. And when you were doing your mobility analysis, the data that you were using was data that was accumulated by the town?
It was both. So we looked at the data that was accumulated by the town as part of the mobility study that was done a few years ago, as well as the data,
Microphone, please.
sorry, as well as the data that was collected by the applicant's traffic engineer.
And did you see any substantial variance between the two sets of data and your conclusions?
We did not. So we saw an increase in the current traffic volumes today versus what was done in the mobility study a few years ago that were in line with the growth that you may see on these corridors.
And so the rating of the intersections, the total flow, basically with both calculations, with both sets of data, basically came to the same conclusion.
Generally the same, correct.
Okay, and in that, you know, we do have a concept called TDM. That's it, TDM. With the TDM, did you use a explain what that is and whether or not you used a conservative estimate of that or a
Sure,
goal estimate of that?
So TDM is a transportation demand management program. It's a set of programs that are put together by the redeveloper and the tenants of the project to look at reducing the reliance on automobiles going to this site. And the stated goal in the plan is 25% reduction. So the analyses that we've done and the impacts that you see do not account for that TDM program being implemented.
So it's actually a more conservative approach, not factoring in the TDM component.
Correct. There is a slight reduction in the models that were done to account for transit that you would see typically at this type of site, given the location of the train station, and that number was 10% for the office component. So the goal is 25. The data was done at 10%.
Okay. And when the planning board reviews this plan, you have the discussion with reference to the two intersections that are adversely impacted, which namely are Morris and Elm and Morris and Ridgedale, which both have a lowering of the standard as to the rating of those intersections without improvements. So there can be recommended improvements. They'll do a full analysis of that. So at that time is when we should be discussing, are there going to be impacts on other streets by diversion of cars, by limiting certain turns or turns at certain times of the day? Explain how that process might work in terms of evaluating those two intersections, what the improvements might be with those two intersections, and how do you avoid the improvements of those two intersections having adverse impacts on neighborhoods or other intersections.
Sure. So we will have an open dialogue with the applicant's traffic engineers when we get to the planning board level, and we'll dive into what are the specific impacts at both those intersections in terms of movements, individual movements, and what potential solutions could we come up with to remedy those impacts. But also, as you alluded to, some of those, if it goes down the path of rerouting traffic, if that's a potential solution, we need to know what those impacts are going to be at different routes that traffic might be looked at. So we'll look at that planning board level and do a full review, and provide our input, as well as our recommendation of what potentially would be a good solution at those two locations.
Okay, when it comes to traffic, I have no other questions. Right, anybody else?
Any other council members have questions that are specific to traffic? No? All right, any other questions that you'd like to ask before we open up the,
For Phil?
yeah, any?
Phil,
Sure.
question for you. You know, again, I think also the public has to understand, yes, we're constantly getting other versions of this document, because it is a living document, which is good. And I think what you see in the outline that Phil presented is actually the documents today is not going to be the same document that we're going to see in another few weeks. It's going to continue to evolve, it's going to continue to.
Well, it's not.
Okay.
This will be, once this ordinance is introduced, assuming that it is, the plan cannot change. And to that end, you know, you can't do a red line. The document has to be a clean version of the ordinance that if it is introduced tonight, it will be on file in the clerk's office. And that will not change. If there is any change, any material change to that document, then by law, you would have to reintroduce the ordinance again.
So the planning board could send it back to.
So the planning board, what will happen is, assuming that the ordinance is introduced tonight, it goes to the planning board tomorrow night, I believe. And the planning board, no, not tomorrow.
It would go the 9th if it went.
The 9th, okay. The planning board would review the document for master plan consistency and could make whatever other recommendations it would want to make. If the planning board were to make recommendations that would cause a plan to change in any material way, then there would be a requirement that the council would have to reintroduce, if it wanted to incorporate those changes, it would have to reintroduce the ordinance and go through the process again in that way. So if that doesn't happen, then if it's introduced tonight, that will be the final document. What will continue to evolve is there will be more specificity, more meat on the bones, as it were, with regard to some of the issues that were touched upon tonight that cannot be fully developed in the plan, in the redevelopment plan. For example, just when the hard engineering is done, the details are done for a site plan submission, there will be more analysis and more specificity given to the roundabout with regard to pedestrian and cyclist safety. If the applicant cannot satisfy the planning board that condition is safe at the site, that would be a basis for the planning board to deny the application. Because the planning board can deny the application if there is not safe ingress and egress at the site, and that also applies to pedestrians and cyclists. So the applicant will have to demonstrate in a more enhanced way than the plan provides currently that the condition are safe at the site. In addition to that, ordinarily, the planning board cannot consider off-site conditions with respect to traffic volume as a basis to deny an application. However, as was alluded to by Councilman Armington, the redevelopment agreement will provide a contractual basis for the board to be able to require some reasonable improvements in the two intersections that were identified where service levels will be adversely affected as a result of the project, as a way to mitigate those impacts in connection with the site plan application. We have to establish that link through the redevelopment agreement. So the plan takes it as far as the plan can, okay, but there will be additional specificity with regard to some of the items touched upon by yourself and Councilman Armington that will be, more specified in both the redevelopment agreement and at the planning board level to further enhance the plan. It will be effective that way.
Is that all? Well, you can ask any
Oh,
questions.
Okay, just, again, one of the items that's not addressed in this plan, but I want to call this, you're not going to hear anything new in our dialogue, is I know that this project overall for this redevelopment area is basically being phased. And what we're dealing in here is what's being called phase 3. One of our concerns that I've heard from the public is actually the integrity of the slopes in the open space across the street on the south side of Spring Street. And a particular concern there is the impact it would have on Presbyterian Church, the impact it might have on the cemetery there. Also, the goal of not totally enclosing one of our landmarks here in Morristown. So, one of the things we've noticed that in the redevelopment ordinance, a lot of the environmental requirements, i.e. steep slopes, and Stefan's actually much more articulate on this than I am, hate to pull you in on this, and i.e. wetlands, when you start getting near the property, are not necessarily specifically clear that they apply to these redevelopment areas. So one of our concerns will be going forward is, the conservation of the space around the Presbyterian Church, around the cemetery, and making sure that we protect the environmental sensitivities of those properties that are on top of the hill and possible wetlands on the bottom.
Can I just provide some clarification since I got sucked into this?
My job is to bring up the issues. And
The steep slope ordinance is a town regulation which prohibits disturbance of steep slopes over 15% grade with the general knowledge that they present environmentally sensitive areas. Wetlands are regulated by the state, and any development anywhere in the United States has no jurisdiction to disturb those resources. Back to the steep slopes, the steep slope ordinance provides opportunities for planning board and zoning board applicants to seek variances for hardship purposes. The zoning code, the 2018 zoning code, specifically excludes areas designated in need of redevelopment from steep slopes, and so I think that was recently brought to our attention, and I believe we will be looking at that through our normal council action as to whether or not that change needs to be made to the zoning code.
And there's also a couple additional things based on our conversations. So a lot of I think you bring up great points. I think that these are critical properties. I agree with you that the church is, really like one of the hearts of Morristown, and the viewshed of that needs to be preserved. The properties that you've spoken of, I just want to be clear, are not part of this redevelopment plan. The parts of this redevelopment plan are only those properties hatched in red here, or outlined in red. Some of these, I just want to make sure the public understands sort of the context here, that these are properties that are, steep slopes that lead up to the back of the cemetery here. These are properties that could, if built too tall, could impact the visibility of the church, or the viewshed of the church. These were things that, when we discussed, and I think, it was good, I'm glad you brought them up. But we, even at the advice of council, it was recommended that we should really limit this amendment to the properties that were going to be impacted by the project. These are all under common ownership. We didn't want to poke any sleeping bears by taking other people's properties that weren't working with us amicably and proactively to start to decrease their development rights now. If that is something the council is interested in pursuing, we're here, and it's something that you absolutely can do. If you're going to do it, just please do it under a separate ordinance, so in case that one gets challenged, this one won't get dragged into court with it.
Phil, I will also mention that, the other large concern is actually the sufficiency of the public space, but again, I think you did a good job with your introduction. In terms of the setbacks being primarily 40 feet with the promenade, preserving the 10 feet, it was a good explanation that it is a substantial promenade, and it's between the setback and with the setback of the top levels of each one of the buildings, it does minimize the height impact to a certain degree. We appreciate that. The other thing that might be helpful for the public, because it will come up maybe in public comment, is what is the ability of the planning board in terms of the design of the exterior of the building, as you called it, differentiating the context or the surface of the building,
Sure.
whatever.
Sure.
What is the ability of the planning board? What can they do and to what degree can that, do they have authority on that review?
Yeah, there is significant, as we've really put in all of our redevelopment plans, and we followed a recipe, frankly, that's worked. Maybe not everybody has agreed with every architectural decision or artistic decision that has been made in the past 10 years, but I think that everybody would agree they're all high quality. Some of them are provocative buildings, but that we have found language and we found a process that works in terms of getting your input, getting the public's input, and getting the planning board's expertise to craft, you know, I think several beautiful buildings, some of the most beautiful buildings built in the state in the last 10 years. So that language is all in here. For members of the public who are interested, this is online or will be online if and when it is introduced. I believe it's a public document. Will be. So starting on page 32 of the document, it talks about building design standards and regulates everything from the materials and color to the entry treatments, the site design, facade articulation, the rhythm, the vertical rhythm, the horizontal rhythm, the facade planes, materials, fenestration patterns, building openings, all of that stuff. Even the way that the planning, not even, especially the way that the parking garage is adorned on the exterior, because like I've always said, there are no backyards in Morristown. There are no backs of buildings. These are fishbowls that everybody can see from certain angles. We want to make sure they look good for everybody that gets to see them.
And Phil, and this may be a question for John. There's two clauses actually in the agreement that had a lot of discussion, but I think it's important that we actually review them. The one is clause 7.6.2, which is site plan subdivision review. And I believe that language was put in there appropriately to allow the developer to have some flexibility in finance. But it does say that the property can be subdivided, but I think from the position of the town, our concern is with that provision is that the obligation of the overall property is a common contact, and secondly, that the terms and conditions of any this agreement or the planning board or any approval can't be compromised due to any type of subdivision purposes of financing.
So, right, so there's a couple of issues that are implicated there. One is that it is envisioned that at the moment that the buildings will be phased. They won't all be built at the same time, they'll be built at different times. So the redevelopment agreement will address that phasing issue. This developer has requested, not uncommonly, that it be permitted to have separate ownership, again, for financing purposes and for alienation purposes. Now, while the redevelopment process is ongoing, you would have to approve any change in ownership to any of the buildings. There would be a provision in the redevelopment agreement that provides for that. Once all of the redevelopment obligations of the redeveloper have been satisfied, then the redeveloper would be issued a certificate of completion, which would signify the end of the redevelopment process, and then they wouldn't have to come back to you for permission to sell, you know, a portion of the project, unless there was a financial agreement, and then they would have to do that for the duration of the financial agreement. With regard to, I think you're getting sort of common maintenance, making sure that the common areas, particularly those that are accessible to the public, are maintained. Discussed this issue today with the developer's attorney. There will be a restricted covenant in the form of a maintenance agreement that will be recorded as an encumbrance on the property that will obligate the developer to address that, to all the property owners to address that. So, you know, they would all be responsible for ensuring that there was a certain level of upkeep with regard to the streetscape, et cetera. So we'll address that by way of a separate agreement, again, which will be recorded
Morristown.